Hello, everybody. Welcome to this presentation. We're going to be talking about price feeds as public goods. I'm Jasper. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Ceta. Ceta is the foundation for data on Web3. Essentially, it's a horizontally scalable oracle with sustainable economics that also allows you to outsource compute. We won't dive into the architecture too much today, since that would take quite a while. It's not the subject. But what we are doing today is announcing that we're actually building our own network. It's called Cetachain. It's built on a Cosmos stack. And we truly believe that this will be the underlying infrastructure that will power all data flow on Web3 into the future. Yeah. And also, like the goal of this presentation is essentially the subject came up building this thing. Like, this is what we're talking about, is something you can build on top of our network. So at launch, we will support any EVM chain, and in the future, we will roll out to non-EVM chains as well. We're looking to launch a public testnet in the next 2-3 months. Actually, yeah, wow, time's flying, like 1.5, 2 months, with mainnet hopefully Q1 2024. We have a bunch of money that we raised. I don't know. Okay. So public goods infrastructure. Let's kick off. Like, why are we talking about this? Take a step back. What defines a public good? Public good is something that's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Which makes sense, right? You have like a good, it's non-excludable, it's non-rivalrous, but the first time I read that, I was like, what and what? So non-excludable means something that is hard or impossible to be excluded from using. So even if you didn't pay for it, it's something that's still usable to you. So I think the clearest example of this, for example, is a public park. I can fly to any country where I'm not paying taxes and enter public parks without somebody telling me, hey, wait, you're not a citizen, you cannot be here. And the opposite would be like, let's say, a pizza or something. If I don't pay for the pizza, I'm not getting the pizza. Something that's non-rivalrous means that simply because somebody uses something doesn't mean that now one less person has access to it. So an example of this, for example, is national security. If you are a citizen or you're residing in a country that has a public national security, just because you have a neighbor or a neighbor enters your village doesn't mean that you now are less secure, depending on the neighbor. But yeah, so why are we talking about price feeds? Like, why is this something that's worth discussing? Well, in order to do that, let's take one step back and talk about oracles. Why are price feeds a thing? Well, smart contracts, by definition, don't have access to data outside of their execution environment. To like make that a little bit more clear, if you deploy a smart contract on Ethereum, all it has is access to data that's actually on Ethereum. It doesn't have any access to real-world data or anything that's not happening on chain. So what people have done is they've built, I call them like data bridges that bridge data from the real world to blockchains, and now that data becomes usable because it's accessible to a smart contract, which enables use cases such as randomness. If you've ever minted an NFT, you've used an oracle. Circuit breakers to prevent bridge attacks or hacks. Real-world assets. It literally has in the name, real world. That means that you need a bridge to the real world in order to define what a public asset is on chain and make it accessible. Perpetuals to set liquidation and pricing, and lending markets to set collateralization ratios and perform liquidations as well. And then there's a bunch more, and a lot of these requires price feeds specifically. Price feeds are truly a core infrastructure for any DeFi protocol, and not having price feeds live on your protocol means that you are heavily restricted in the amount of protocols or the brevity of protocols that can be built on your network. So in our opinion, price feeds should be cheap, easy to deploy and access, backed by sustainable economics, because if you're building a decentralized network that should work into perpetuity, and you're building it on a centralized service that provides you your data, that means that a lot of your selling points are essentially down the drain. And rewarding data providers based on quality of data, right? Like fair value distribution. We're not seeing this a lot in current Oracle models. basically paying the people actually providing the data based on the quality, so having like an open market for this, essentially. And it should be accessible from any L1 or L2, which comes back to the sustainable economics, to the accessibility. It should be a core, it's a core infrastructure, so it should be accessible from any ecosystem, is the idea. So essentially, how have public goods been funded historically? There's like three most obvious ones. There's a lot more, but like the most like obvious ones would be taxes. So if you are a tax citizen somewhere, you're paying taxes. That's being used to fund public goods infrastructure, public goods, in general, or bonds. Right? You have people that issue certain bonds for large projects. The darker side of things like war bonds, for example, but there's other examples. And then there is companies that turn out to be building public goods. So you have, for example, public radio, where anybody has access to it, but they fund it essentially by advertising, right? So by using the service, you are essentially paying for the service. And then philanthropists and foundations, which is another one. All right. So what are the parallels between existing public infrastructure funding and Web3? Well, I'd say that you could make a comparison between transaction fees on a blockchain and VAT. You're essentially paying for the added value of having immutable and deterministic transactions, compute being done on your transactions, and you're paying a dynamic tax based on competitiveness of block space, essentially, for that transaction. Yeah, so that's one way to fund public goods, like Ethereum's funded that way for a large part. But another part that's more of a hidden tax for ETH, for example, is MEV. MEV used to stand for miner extractable value. Since ETH pivoted to proof of stake, maximal extractable value, to keep the abbreviation is more accurate. And essentially, MEV is the amount of money that a validator can make by reordering, censoring, or including certain transactions into a block. Originally, the picture that was painted by the people that were early on researching this was that it would be the miners themselves performing computations to see the maximum value of a block. Right now, what we're seeing is that's more done by searchers and then block builders, so that the sort of like stakeholders in this ecosystem has broadened greatly and are not the same as people thought they would be. But essentially, the validators end up making a lot of money based off of the MEV in blocks, certain blocks. That takes us to OEV, Oracle Extractable Value. If we push data on chain as an oracle, it creates a new chain state. Changes of chain state create opportunities. Opportunities are being taken advantage of by miners or validators or searchers. So essentially what we're doing is we have built something we call data flow auctions. So what we're doing is we're auctioning off the right to backrun Oracle updates, and we actually like internalize that revenue now. So what happens today is that what happens today is like if there is a price feed update in the mempool, there is a bunch of MEV searchers. They simulate exactly what's going to happen, how much money can be made, and they do like flashbots auctions to get that revenue, essentially, right? We're saying, well, if we own the entire supply chain from data to network, we can actually internalize that revenue by bundling our transactions beforehand and having the auction done on our network. And that could, in theory, greatly subsidize our network and make transactions a lot cheaper. That's quite challenging. So there is like a very much like a good thing that can happen and a bad thing that can happen based on this. I stole this slide. I see Jacob taking a picture from. Dystopia is OEV profits are not being used to subsidize fees at all. OAV profits are not distributed in a fair way. So basically, it's the validators in our network are like, oh, great, like we're making a bunch of money off OAV, we're just going to keep it ourselves and like just pocket it, essentially. And since MEV in general is very much volatility driven, it's very hard to predict and have sustainable revenue projections, so it's hard to build trust in the system relatively. And the utopia is that the OEV is so high that you can actually query data for free using our network. And that it's obviously just the opposite of the other points. So like OEV profits are shared amongst all stakeholders in a fair way, and revenue is consistent and predictable, resulting in faith in the system. I think I rushed through that pretty fast. I don't know how we are on time. Okay, yeah, questions?
If you have a question, just raise your hands.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. So how sustainable do you think this model, if price feeds are actually become free?
Yes.
Compared to, we see like the model of Chainlink. I mean, they have like crazy fees per query. How sustainable do you think this would be?
Well, it's very hard. Like we're doing research on the exact numbers of OEV available, and we know it's pretty high. But we need to gain a lot of market dominance, essentially, to take up enough of that sort of like pie in order to make it sustainable. Also, on the other side of things, in this, I also make the assumption that compute is going to be cheaper into the future, and like querying decentralized networks is going to be cheaper also. So it's definitely a long-term vision. And you also have, of course, market-driven sort of like, if it becomes free, then people can start spamming it and that type of stuff. So I don't know how realistic it is, but a man can dream.
Thanks. Hello?
Hello.
Hi. Yeah, so is this part of your sort of market capture strategy, internalizing value so you can offer a cheaper Oracle service? Is that how you're seeing it?
Kind of like a flywheel.
What other strategies are you deploying to compete against Chainlink?
Yeah, so I think, in my opinion, our greatest sort of selling point is that our data is queryable from any layer 1 without us having to deploy there. So all you have to do is deploy a smart contract that can parse our proof, and our data becomes accessible. All you need is one relayer to send the proof over, essentially, right? So that's one. So you can eat up a lot of the security on, or like Oracle security on new chains where Chainlink's not live, and that builds reputation, and then hopefully over time that becomes a convincing argument. Another thing we do is allow for arbitrary compute. So when you issue a data request, it's sort of like an HTTP request, the default state essentially. You can add a WASM binary on how the data should be computed exactly. And that can be super, super advanced. So you can actually do super advanced computation on our network that would normally not be possible on a smart contract.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm just wondering, so if you're talking about the verifiability, is it possible to expand this to like LLMs by any chance?
By what?
Expand it to like LLM usage on the network.
It's something we toy around with the idea of like ML and LLM on our network. I don't know why you would do it, but in theory, it should be possible to build a pretty crappy LLM model on our infrastructure, I think.
Yeah, I guess the reply to your answer was like, essentially, there might be a trend where proposals of governance could be like, kind of just replaced or verified by LLMs.
Huh.
Yeah, it's just open.
Yeah, I mean, you can also, with our system, it would be easier to query GPT-3 through, that would be like the first step. So you can query GPT-3 to like perform some sort of an analysis on a proposal.
Can I ask you how the consensus mechanism that determined the price, determined the update, look like?
Yep. So our own chain is a Tendermint chain, but we have something we call an overlay network. So the overlay network is essentially a network of independent nodes that can be selected randomly by our main network, and they perform the computation and querying It's like a secret committee, essentially, that gets selected by our proof of stake network. Then we have a secret committee that actually performs the querying and computation, and they then get to consensus using commit reveal. We have some other security mechanisms built in because it is susceptible to 51% attacks. We have something that's solved for that, but I think it would be too deep to dive into right now.
As of today, who are the nodes in the
So as of today, so we're looking to launch this specifically late this year, publicly. Right now, what we're doing, we have Oracle products live, and that's like a first-party Oracle model. So it's like data providers pushing data on chain directly themselves.
And signing it?
Sorry?
And signing it?
Yeah, yeah. So the idea with that model was essentially that we'd use that to get the market, see if our business strategy worked. It did. Last year we grew in 7 weeks from 0 total value secured to 3.7 billion. So actually grew in like no time to the second largest Oracle. And then we came up with like a very large list of reasons why we didn't like that model. And we're like, okay, let's go back to the drawing board. And now that we know our strategy works and people want oracles, let's actually build something that scales, right? And fits the philosophy of our space. I think that's also core, yeah.
Super interesting, and I totally agree. What the 3.7 million stands for?
Sorry?
What the 3.7 million stands for?
3.7 billion total value secured.
Total value secure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So like, essentially, if somebody would have hacked our Oracle, it would have been able to steal 3.7 billion. That's the, yeah. In 7 weeks, that's sleeping under your desk type money, you know?
Thank you.
Yeah, right. Cool.
If somebody else have questions, please raise your hand.
Okay, yeah, perfect.
If no more questions.
Thanks, everybody.